Welcome to the studio at African Utility Week. Today I'm with Peter Ballinger from OPIC. Peter, I believe that you are here with a delegation from Power Africa. What was the decision around coming to African Utility Week?
Well, I think Africa Utility Week is the premier event in Africa. We do have a delegation led by a very senior member of our energy team at the U.S. State Department, all the way down to those of us that are actually implementing the project. So we have our export credit agency, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, my organization, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. What we tried to do was put together a delegation that could not only talk at the policy level with many of the utility executives here about the regulatory framework, all of the things that need to happen in order to help projects move forward, but then also to have those of us in the finance sector who are actually working on the project and implementing the project. So we've had meetings with private sector, American companies, African companies, joint ventures, other funders. So it's been a very good event.
That is fantastic that you're having those conversations face to face.
Yes.
In terms of off-grid solutions, what is the sufficient interest in it in the African continent?
Well, OPIC has been doing power in Africa for as long as I have been at OPIC, which is almost 25 years. Almost all of it was grid connected, big projects. 5 or 7 years ago, we began being approached by people who had off-grid solutions, primarily clean energy, solar primarily, one mini hydro in Rwanda. And what we discovered was that while we can continue to do large grid-connected projects, as a development agency, as a development finance institution, there are people in Africa who are, in all likelihood, never going to be connected to the grid. It's too expensive, and the U.S. and African partners have the expertise to deploy these, what I would call distributed power projects, so that they can help people who, again, are not going to be connected to the grid. I look at it in some ways as analogous to what Africa did in mobile telephony, where many people just catapulted over landlines. Again, they weren't going to be connected, and mobile telephony really took off in Africa. And I live in Africa now. I see people doing things much more technologically advanced with their telephones than what Americans do. So I think that has been replicated in the off-grid sector, where people are not even waiting for the grid to come to them, not South Africa, but in many African countries, and in areas of the country that are somewhat economically prosperous, whether they're agriculture or small industry, off-grid solutions really work. And they're clean, by and large.
But then what are the risks around investing in those off-grid solutions?
Well, from a lender's standpoint, there's always the risk that there may not be a tradition of paying for power. What we found is that people who don't have power, when it is delivered, they will pay. Almost all of these schemes mitigate the risk by prepayment of the electricity. And this is where mobile telephony comes in as well, because you don't have to go down to the local shop to pay it or find the utility. You can actually top up your meter on your mobile telephone. So people have power when they need it. And we have not had any of the projects, they're new, but we have not had any of the projects that have run into non-payment issues. I think one of the risks is the lack of a regulatory environment for these off-grid solutions. So people are actually making investments in off-grid solutions, and we're financing them without really knowing what regulations might be promulgated in future.
That is a very big concern.
It is, and it should be.
Yes, and outside of Africa, in Europe, in North America, in South America. Are off-grid solutions being invested into?
They are. Before I moved to South Africa, I was in India for 3 years. And India, while its grid is, as a country, fairly sophisticated, there are lots of rural areas where they're currently burning diesel fuel, for example, for hydro pumps, where they're converting to off-grid solar solutions, as well as off-grid waste-to-energy solutions, burning rice husks, for example. A very well-known project that we helped fund originally is called Husk Power Systems. And in a rather relatively prosperous rice-growing region of northeastern India, the farmers were paying to have their rice milled. Now the farmers are actually getting paid to deliver the rice husks as an energy input to the millers, who then mill it and sell it to the people who are producing the electricity by gasifying rice husks. So it has the potential to be very transformative in regions.
Sustainable.
And it's completely sustainable and scalable. You don't want to do just one village or 2 villages. I think Husk Power right now is probably up to 200, 300 villages. It's really what we want to do here in Africa. We don't want to have an off-grid solution that just helps a small number of villages. We want to work with investors who can scale it to villages throughout a region across the country, and then potentially even create mini-grids where they might be connected, even though they're not going to be connected necessarily to the national grid.
You mentioned the regulatory environment and the concerns around that. What would you advise governments?
Well, in fact, we are advising governments through the Power Africa program. In many countries, there is a technical or transactions advisor. And in addition to Power Africa trying to create 30,000 megawatts of grid-connected power, they also have a program called Beyond the Grid, which is exactly what OPIC has always done on these off-grid projects. And so Power Africa is working with regulators and working with governments to impress upon them the importance, if off-grid solutions are to grow, to put in place a regulatory framework that allows investors to be comfortable making these investments, including local investors. The foreign investors have come in first, largely because they wanted to do something that was highly developmental. But I think when the second wave of investors come in who are really looking for that market opportunity, they're going to look to the regulatory framework to reassure their investors, their boards of directors and such, that it is a sustainable, commercially viable and safe investment to make.
And lastly, you've been involved in a lot of projects worldwide. Which one has been the most interesting for you and why?
Well, I think in Africa, on the large scale, the most interesting one was the Togo project, gas-fired, that we did with Contour Global, primarily because it doubled or maybe even tripled generation capacity in Togo. So that, for a country like Togo that had a strong energy deficit, that was very good to work on. Gigawatt Global in Rwanda, which outside of South Africa is the largest grid-connected solar project in sub-Saharan Africa, which I think increased Rwanda's generation capacity by 6 or 7%, 8.5 megawatts. That was interesting. Deventus in East Africa, which is selling solar panels with a prepayment mechanism that essentially allows the purchaser or the renter, rent to purchase, I guess, the customers would be called, with a light bulb and a cell phone charging unit. And it's sellable. They're working with a mobile telephone company, and they're working with an existing consumer goods company. So there are ready-made outlets throughout East Africa that can sell this very inexpensive technology. So one is grid connected, one is our first clean solar power project outside of South Africa, and the other one is, I think, very innovative in serving the kinds of people in sub-Saharan Africa that really, as a development agency, we want to reach, in addition to putting more power onto the grid.
We've had some very interesting projects both on grid and off grid, and thank you very much for sharing those with us, and thank you for watching.